Hi, everybody, and thank you for joining and being here for this timely and important summit of our network. My name is Jared Duval, and I have the great privilege of serving as our network's executive director. For those of you who are newer to our work, I want to clarify that the Energy Action Network is really two things. First, and most importantly, it is you. It is a diverse network of about 200 members and public partners from agencies and departments and legislators. Most of the organizations and people joining this summit today are the Energy Action Network. And you all work together towards a shared mission to achieve Vermont's 90% renewable total energy commitment and to significantly reduce Vermont's greenhouse gas emissions in ways that create a more just, thriving, and sustainable future for Vermonters. Additionally, we also have a small 3-person backbone nonprofit organization, also named EAN, that it exists to serve your network. EAN, the organization, plays 2 key roles. First, we serve as a neutral convener of a really wide diversity of members. Because you sometimes have different positions on issues, we do that, we convene in a neutral way, and we do not take positions on pieces of legislation. However, we believe that good evidence and data matters deeply, especially for effective program and policy design. So we also see our role as helping to ground and advance Vermont's energy and climate conversation with the best available information and analysis. We also believe that collaboration matters, that the best ideas come from working together on complex challenges and opportunities, and that the purpose of a collective impact network like ours is to bring diverse perspectives together, creatively craft ideas, develop possibilities, that are stronger, bigger than the sum of their parts. You'll see that in action, hear it in action this afternoon with the pitches that you and many network members have been working on over the past few months. But before we go to the pitches, let's try to ground things with where we stand now and the scale and pace of action that will be necessary to meet what are now our legal requirements, no matter where you stood on the question of the Global Warming Solutions Act. Over the next half hour, I'm going to cover the topics of energy, emissions, the economy, and equity. So the Global Warming Solutions Act is now law, and that means that Vermont is required to do just what we've said we'd do: cut emissions at least 26% below 2005 levels by 2025. Now, the most recent year that we have full greenhouse gas emissions inventory for Vermont is through 2016, thanks to the Vermont Agency of Natural Resources and their greenhouse gas emissions inventory for the whole state. This graph shows greenhouse gas emissions as measured by million metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. For context, a million metric tons of CO2 equivalent is the equivalent of burning over 100 millions of gallons of gasoline, or of driving 200,000 passenger cars for a year. So Vermont's total emissions at nearly 10 million metric tons a year is the equivalent of burning over 1 billion gallons of gasoline, or of driving 2 million passenger cars for 10,000 miles. This graph also allows you to see where our emissions have come from historically by sector between 1990 and 2016. The energy sectors of transportation in green, thermal in orange, and electricity in blue. For further reference off to the right, you can see what trajectory we need to get on to meet our legal requirements for 2025 and 2030 and 2050. From this inventory, we also see that as of 2016, Vermont was only 5% below our 2005 emissions levels. And that represents the least amount of progress made by any state in the region towards the Paris Agreement commitment. Let's widen the lens a little bit further, because another important baseline is not just 2005, but 1990. Specifically, our 2030 emissions reduction target included in both the Comprehensive Energy Plan and now the Global Warming Solutions Act is a 40% reduction below that 1990 level that you see here. As of 2016, our emissions were actually a million metric tons, more than a million metric tons higher, 13% above that 1990 number. Why? The biggest reason is the increase in our transportation sector emissions shown here in green. So even though our electricity sector emissions have declined significantly, and you see that here on the right, more than any other sector, in fact, that decrease has been overwhelmed by the increase in transportation sector emissions. not to mention emissions from residential, commercial, and industrial fuel use, especially for heating, which you see here. A big reason for this increase in transportation sector emissions is that there are currently more miles driven per person in Vermont than any state in the region, and this has been going up. While this slide doesn't show it because we don't yet have comparative data up to date from the other states, the latest number for Vermont is now nearly 12,000 miles per person as of 2017, and that number has been increasing over the last 4 years. Additionally, while vehicles have been getting more efficient overall, you see a fleet-wide increase of about 2 miles per gallon between 2012 and 2018 here. Vermonters have nevertheless been buying bigger and bigger vehicles over that period, limiting the benefit that we could be getting from increased fuel efficiency standards. Specifically, in 2018, 80% of new vehicles sold in Vermont were SUVs or light trucks, and only 20% were passenger cars. 7 years ago, that share was very different, 55% SUVs and trucks and 45% passenger cars. Our transportation choices, both those more miles driven and the bigger, less efficient vehicles that we've been buying, are the main reason that Vermont now has the highest per capita greenhouse gas emissions of any state in the region, at over 15 tons per person here in the orange bar. Beyond transportation, which as you see here is responsible for about 45% of our total emissions, the next biggest source of climate pollution in Vermont is our thermal energy use at about 28%. This is primarily fossil fuels used for building heating. Together, how we currently get around and heat our homes and buildings, these two combined is responsible for over 70% of our total emissions. Within the thermal sector, nearly 3/4 of our heating comes from fossil fuels. And here's a breakdown by heating type. You see fuel oil is the largest at about 1/3, and we also have a significant use of natural gas and propane, which also contribute to those emissions. Furthermore, the majority of this thermal fuel use happens at the residential level, followed by commercial buildings and then industrial use last. That means that it's not someone else's problem to solve. We all have a responsibility here. I want to pause and go back to this slide for a moment. While the last full emissions inventory for Vermont takes us through the year 2016, there are already certain sectors that we have data for through 2018, and that includes the electric sector. And what those data show is that from just between 2015 and 2018, emissions from electricity purchases have declined by over 80%, from over 900,000 metric tons in 2015 to just 200,000 metric tons in 2018. Because of that progress in our electric sector, progress that's mostly thanks to the renewable energy standard, we have likely already gotten more than 1/4 of the way toward our Paris climate commitment. But there's only so much more progress we can get from that sector. Because we see that the next emissions inventory, even though this one shows electricity at 8%, when those numbers are reflected, that number is going to get down to about 2% of our overall emissions, while the transportation and building thermal sectors shares are going to go up even further. Now, a big question is what has happened to emissions in 2020? Specifically, how much has the pandemic and the economic contraction affected our emissions? To what degree will that be a blip versus what changes might prove to be more durable? The short answer is we don't know yet. The Agency of Natural Resources is gearing up to complete a new statewide emissions inventory later this year, but even that will only give us full emissions data through 2017 and just partial data for 2018 and 2019. However, most experts who look at this agree that emissions will not decline in a healthy and durable way until and unless we begin switching out the underlying cause of most of the problem. And that's all of the gas and diesel vehicles and all of the fossil fuel heating systems that drive our fossil fuel use and climate pollution. Now, we may see a marginal decline especially in transportation due to changes in commuting patterns. But at the same time, some neighboring states are saying that vehicle miles traveled may actually be increasing as fewer people use public transit, carpooling declines, and people take more single occupancy trips. When it comes to thermal sector emissions, two of the most important variables to look at are, number one, how cold are the winters? That really drives it. And we measure that by heating degree days. And the second is the price of fossil fuels. On the first, the pandemic and the economic situation are not going to affect the weather. On the second, the current prices for fossil fuel heating are now lower than their historical average. And so they may, if anything, increase consumption and therefore pollution from that sector. But so again, until and unless we get to the underlying causes of emissions, the vehicles and the heating equipment that drives our fossil fuel use, and begin changing them out at the end of their life with efficient electric and lower cost options, we are unlikely to move the needle much at all. That's why our Path to Paris model, developed by EAN's senior fellow Lee Seddon, primarily looks at proven and available technologies and best practices, especially as you see in the transportation and thermal sectors, where most of our challenges and opportunities are. And this models a way for Vermont to meet our Paris commitment. Now, this is not necessarily a prescription, but if we do less in one of these areas, one of these bars, we'd have to make it up in another. We don't need everyone to change their vehicle or heating system right away. We can do this if an ever-increasing share of Vermonters just simply stop buying new fossil fuel vehicles and stop installing new fossil fuel heating systems, instead opting for efficient electric and advanced wood heat options at the point of their next purchase. The model here also calls for increasing rates of home weatherization and retrofits and more efficient transportation choices beyond EVs. This model raises a very important question. What would this kind of transformation of how we get around and heat our homes and buildings mean for Vermont consumers and the Vermont economy? So we asked the Vermont Agency of Commerce and Community Development to answer those very questions. And what their independent review found, using very conservative assumptions, is that this large-scale shift from imported fossil fuels to more efficient and low-carbon sources, primarily electricity, for transportation and heating in Vermont over the next 15 years could prevent over $1 billion from draining out of the Vermont economy, save Vermonters nearly $800 million, and create jobs by increasing in-state investment by over $300 million. The takeaway? While meeting our emissions reduction commitments will be a challenge, doing so is mostly an economic opportunity. In fact, being required to meet our emissions reduction commitments has the potential to be one of the biggest sources of savings for Vermonters and one of the most effective economic development strategies Vermont could have for the next decade when we are sorely in need of one. How? First, because fossil fuels are just more expensive and price volatile than the alternatives when you look over any span of time. Second, because Vermont imports 100% of the fossil fuel we use, we send billions of dollars out of our state every year. So in short, fossil fuels put both a strain on Vermonters' budget and are a major drain on the Vermont economy. Let's start with fossil fuel prices. Going electric or using local sustainable wood heating both saves money and improves your quality of life. Fossil fuel lobbyists want you to think that going fossil free is somehow about loss or sacrifice, but it's not at all. As you can see here, over time, the highest cost, most price volatile ways to get around are with gas or diesel vehicles. That is the past. You see the gas and diesel in the upper left in the gray and orange here. And the highest and most price volatile ways to heat your home are in the gray and purple, fuel oil and propane. Quite simply, fossil fuels put a strain on Vermonters' budgets because of these cost curves. Efficient and renewable transportation and heating options present massive opportunities to save Vermonters money by getting off of these high and roller coaster-like cost curves to lower and more predictable options like electricity for heat pumps, shown in blue here in the lower right, or electricity for an EV here in the upper left in green, or for wood heating options shown in the green in the lower right. Also, EVs require less maintenance than fossil vehicles. They cost less to fuel, as you see here, and it's even lower than this in many cases, less than $1 equivalent in GMP territory, 60 cents a gallon in Burlington Electric territory. EVs purchased in Vermont also now cost less to buy or lease than the average new fossil vehicle. if you look at the mid and full-size average of what people are actually buying. Personally, I pay only about $200 a month to lease my Nissan Leaf. And while fuel heating prices are temporarily at historic lows due to the pandemic, over time, fuel oil and propane have proven to be much more expensive and price volatile, and will likely go back to that, and certainly are not as low over time and predictable as wood heating and efficient electric heating with things like heat pumps. Personally, I cut my heating costs in half over 5 years ago when I moved from fuel oil to wood pellets. The technology and the know-how to be warm without fossil fuels is now readily available. Heat pump water heaters, cold climate heat pump systems in all their iterations, efficient and advanced wood heating, they are all proven and ready to go. This is not new technology anymore. And the same is becoming increasingly true for electric vehicles. EVs can already meet the needs of most Vermonters with 36 models now available here in Vermont, including a dozen that offer all-wheel drive. You can find out more on the single best resource there is on this, the Drive Electric Vermont website. Beyond prices of the fuels, the second big issue is that fossil fuels are a drain on the Vermont economy. And while the exact proportion varies depending on the fuel, on average, about 75 cents of every dollar that we spend on fossil fuels leaves the Vermont economy entirely, to the tune of about $1.5 billion a year. That is a major drag on our approximately $33 billion state economy. The beneficiaries of this fossil fueled status quo are corporations that, as we know, fund climate science denial and delay, or regimes like Russia and Saudi Arabia that abuse human rights and undermine democracy. In contrast, who benefits from electrification? Mostly Vermonters, in terms of how we get around and heat our homes and buildings. When we do that with electricity, 62 cents of every dollar that we spend with our local electric utility will stay right here in our state, supporting our neighbors who are line workers, tree trimmers, or clean power producers. Even more money stays and recirculates in state when you use sustainable wood heating. And this all, of course, matters for jobs. In fact, Vermont already has the highest clean energy employment per capita of any state in the country. At the end of last year, we had about 19,000 total clean energy jobs. And while that number has declined in the wake of the pandemic, we now have a major opportunity to bring them back and then add even more, especially now that our unemployment rate has increased and there are more people looking for work. And these are generally good family supporting jobs. The average hourly wages in the clean energy sector are about $27 an hour. That's quite a bit higher than the statewide median recently, which had been $19 an hour. EAN's Path to Paris approach does not require that everyone go out and buy a different vehicle or heating system right away. Many are in the middle of that investment or the lifespan of those systems. But it does mean that whenever your vehicle or heating system is at the end of its life, an ever-increasing share of us have to opt for efficient electric and advanced wood heat options. Not only can doing so save thousands of dollars over the lifetime of that equipment and help the Vermont economy, it also avoids, crucially, it avoids locking in decades more of fossil fuel use, decades that climate scientists tell us we simply cannot afford. And as consumers, we need to avoid these kind of stranded assets. So each of us can make this basic commitment. Never buy another piece of fossil fueled equipment for which there is an affordable electric or renewable alternative. And with rebates and offers from your electric utility, Efficiency Vermont, and state and federal programs, that is now more often true than not. In these tough economic times, many Vermonters don't want to change a vehicle or heating system unless we have to. But given the life cycles of this equipment, we know that roughly 100,000 Vermonters will purchase a vehicle this year. Roughly 25,000 will have to switch out a water heater. And about 12,500, give or take, will have to replace a heating system, one way or another. If you are in one of those situations, we can make choices that are better for our pocketbooks, wallets, and our health, and our local economy and environment. That's the big opportunity here. To be more specific about it, we need the approximately 35,000 Vermonters a year who buy or lease a new vehicle to prioritize making their next car an electric vehicle. You see that in this graph here. And for the 65,000 Vermonters who will instead buy a used vehicle, there will be multiple benefits from purchasing used EVs, hybrids, or more fuel-efficient fossil options. On the heating side, for Vermonters that have to replace a water heater this year, Committing to switching to a heat pump water heater will reduce pollution and lower costs. And for those who have to replace a heating system, committing to ending use of fuel oil or propane and instead opting for more efficient and renewable heating, such as with cold climate heat pumps or advanced wood heating, really depends on your situation. And of course, each person needs to talk with a professional. But whatever we can do there makes such a difference. And whether it's a lawnmower, a snowblower, a weed whacker, we've got to be choosing those electric options too. Because here is the silver lining. Beyond a direct reduction in emissions from a cleaner electric mix, there is a second, much more powerful benefit to that. When Vermonters switch from fossil fuels to electricity, say for an electric vehicle, a heat pump, or otherwise, we benefit from what is now the lowest emitting power supply of any state in the country, 62% renewable and 92% carbon-free. That means that we can make more of an impact per capita fighting the climate crisis here than any other state in the country when we electrify how we get around and heat our homes. This is often known as beneficial electrification. And electrification is perhaps more beneficial in Vermont now than anywhere else, allowing us to cut our transportation and heating emissions very, very rapidly by taking advantage of that clean electric mix in our purchases. Furthermore, in part because of the great work done around electric efficiency in Vermont, including by leading efficiency utilities like Efficiency Vermont, we now have a significant amount of headroom in our electric transmission and distribution system. This can help us meet the increasing demand for electricity that beneficial electrification of our heating and transportation sectors will create. To be more specific, Velco reports that the electric system is already capable of serving a peak load of about 1,100 megawatts. Recently, Vermont's annual peak loads have been less than 1,000 megawatts, and our historic high was back in 2006. For context, adding 100,000 EVs would likely add about 100 megawatts to our peak load, and that's before accounting for EV control measures already in place. We'd still be under what is, easy to deal with. So while Vermont continues to plan for the transmission and distribution system of the future, in the near term, we can pursue significant amounts of beneficial electrification with win-win benefits for all, including saving all electricity ratepayers money by efficiently using that excess headroom in our transmission and distribution system, in addition to reducing emissions. You'll also note that our path to Paris assumes more responsibility for upper income Vermonters, that they will be the ones buying new vehicles and replacing heating systems. Lower income Vermonters typically buy used cars. And for those who are renters, landlords are the ones responsible for purchasing heating systems. So the expected upfront investment in new vehicles and equipment will come primarily from upper income Vermonters in this model. That's really good from the perspective of lower income Vermonters not facing new investment costs. But it is problematic from the perspective of lower income Vermonters perhaps missing out on the savings and benefits that accrue based on those non-fossil vehicle and heating system choices. We think it's really important to explicitly name these challenges, and that the importance of balancing rapid and cost-effective emissions reduction needs to be understood in the context of equitable emissions reduction strategies. They're not always obviously the same paths to take. For instance, providing a full grant to weatherize a low-income Vermonter's home may not be the quickest or cheapest strategy per ton of carbon avoided from a direct cost-effectiveness perspective. But it is a strategy, an important strategy to advance energy equity. It has many other benefits. Rather than avoid this possible tension, we think it's important to lean into it and explore it carefully. This year, with the help of many network members and a literature review, EAN has come up with a working definition for energy equity. I'm going to read that out. Energy equity is based on the principle that all people should have access to reliable, safe, and affordable sources of energy, protection from a disproportionate share of negative impacts or externalities associated with building and operating our energy supply and distribution systems, and equitable distribution of and access to benefits from these systems. Another key concept and term is energy burden, which both Efficiency Vermont and Vermont Law School, among others, have been doing really important work on. The definition of energy burden, it reflects the percent of total income that household spends on energy. You may already be familiar with these maps from Efficiency Vermont, which show geographic inequity in both energy use on the left and in energy burden on the right. On the left-hand side, you see that towns in Chittenden and Franklin and Addison County in the darker green use more energy. While on the right, perhaps surprisingly, even though they're using less energy, towns in the Northeast Kingdom and in southern Vermont spend a higher share of their income on that generally lower amount of energy they do use. In fact, some people in towns in the Northeast Kingdom spend nearly 20% of their income on energy. You see the red or the dark orange colored towns in the map showing that. This summer, EAN hosted 2 energy equity interns who did research and wrote reports that really helped advance our knowledge in this space. One of the first things that we wanted to look at was, how does energy spending vary not just by geography, as you see here, but also by income, specifically income quintile. The content of these next 6 slides is thanks to the great work of our interns, Jenna Slayton from Dartmouth College and Tara Santee from Middlebury College. One of the most important things to say about energy equity up front is that low-income Vermonters use much less energy than upper-income Vermonters. It's not always well known. Here you see that Vermonters in the 2 highest income quintiles purchase more than twice as much energy as those in the lowest income quintile. However, lower income Vermonters, even though they're using less energy, they still pay a much higher share of their income for the energy that they do have to buy. I think this dynamic is particularly striking when you look at these graphs side by side. For context, many consider an energy burden above 6% of total income to be unsustainable. Currently, about 40% of Vermonters spend more than 6% of their income on energy. Some, as you saw before, more than 20% of their income on energy. And we've got to work to reverse that, as many of you are doing. Looking specifically at heating, lower income Vermonters are disproportionately dependent on 2 of the highest cost heating sources: inefficient old resistance electric systems like baseboard heat and fuel oil. The split incentive, when tenants pay heating bills, landlords have little incentive to make investments that will lower costs for their tenants, has held back potential savings and health improvements for many of our lower income neighbors who are renters. Of all the households in Vermont, 73% are owned and 27% are rented. And there are big differences in how those 2 groups of homes are heated. For instance, a full 20%, as you see here, of renters in the lowest third of the income distribution are still dependent on inefficient and high-cost electric resistance systems. In comparison, very few homeowners, this not even slice isn't even big enough to show a number, use resistance electric systems. So what do we do with all of this data and analysis that I've just dumped on you, shared with you? We use it to inform program and policy design so that we can most effectively both reduce emissions and reduce energy inequities. Good intentions are not enough. We need serious, ambitious, and evidence-based interventions if we are to effectively tackle these challenges and seize these opportunities to meet our moral responsibility and now our legal requirement